Hey. Okay, gotta make sure we're recording. Okay, Sister Zollinger is going to offer our opening prayer, and then I'll just highlight. So Casey, should I highlight your screen or Preston's?
Preston.
Yeah, do mine.
Okay,
Yep.
So I'll spotlight Preston's after our prayer. So.
Great. Our dear Heavenly Father, we're grateful for the opportunity that we have to gather for this activity. We're grateful for Brother Rasmussen and the willingness he has to share his time and talents with us. And we would ask that Thy Spirit would be with us, that we may enjoy our time together, and that more sisters will join us, and that we may feel of Thy love. And we are grateful for the many blessings that we receive at Thy hand, and offer this prayer in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Even got an apron on. Nice.
Well, it's my it's my smoking apron. So.
All right.
All right.
I'm gonna mute us and send it over to Preston.
All right. Well, I understand we only have 40 minutes, so I tried to do some prep work before I got started. This recipe that I follow is really simple. It's a family recipe, but I don't think it's very secret. So just a little bit of background. I got into bread making about I don't know, I guess it's been about 4 or 5 years ago now. My grandmother was like a master bread maker. I mean, she could do just about everything. And I was young enough before she passed, I didn't really have a desire to learn or realize what a skill it was until I started getting in my own kitchen. And so when I started baking bread, I kind of did so out of in her honor, to be honest, and never thought it would turn into what it did. So, my roll recipe and my bread recipe have kind of been handed down through cousins, because my grandmother never really had one recipe that she followed. And I think that's the important thing is the recipe that I give you today, you may find 15 more on the internet that are just a little bit different, but this one's so simple and really fun to do. It makes 4 loaves of bread on a good day if you let it rise right. And so I'll kind of go over the recipe with you, and then I know when we're done here, Cindy will send it out to everyone. But it requires 2 tablespoons of yeast. It requires a 1/3 cup of sugar, a 1/3 cup of whether it be vegetable oil or canola oil. I don't think that necessarily matters. I think that's a matter of preference. And then a tablespoon of salt, and I'm going to tell you it's anywhere between 8 and 10 cups of flour, and I'll explain that as I get into it. So that's kind of the recipe. But when I get started, I'm going to see if I can flip my screen around here and show you. I kind of have all my ingredients laid out, and I'm kind of ready to go. And that way I can kind of track what I'm putting in here. I use a Bosch mixer. You can use a KitchenAid. I would suggest if you have a stand mixer with a dough hook, that you make sure that you grab something, it cleans the bowl a little bit better. So I would suggest using a mixer with a dough hook. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and pass the camera over to Casey, and we can kind of get started. So I was missing one. Where is my 4 cups of? Sorry, I thought I had everything laid out, but apparently I did not. Okay, so I start with my yeast, which I leave my yeast in the freezer, and so it just helps. And again, I think it's one of those family things that I don't know why I really do that. It helps keep it cold and dry. And so I'll start out with 2 tablespoons of yeast, and you just kind of level it off. And I just eyeball it, to be honest. I'm not this is one thing where my grandmother had varied a little bit. It was either a tablespoon or a tablespoon and a half or a tablespoon. It just kind of depended. But anyway, I'll start with 2 tablespoons of yeast. And then I put in a 1/3 cup of sugar. And the reason sugar and yeast go really well together, your yeast eats your sugar. So if you want to just show them, in my mixer, I've just put in my sugar and yeast, and then I'll add in my 4 cups of warm water. And as far as the water is concerned, you really just want it to be almost not too hot where you stick your fingers in and it burns, but almost like you'd use your bath water. And somebody was joking the other day about the fact they like their baths really, really hot. So I think as long as you're not scorching your hand, you're probably going to be fine. And let me just measure that out. Okay, so here goes 4 cups of water in with my sugar and my yeast. And what I do is while this is sitting, you'll be able to see the way that the sugar and the yeast react. That yeast starts to pop and it will start to bubble. And so you could probably see the yeast already starting to just kind of pop and bubble in there. And that's a good sign. It means your water's not too cold, because if it's too cold, your yeast won't rise. And if it's too hot, it will kill your yeast. So there is a fine balance. And I'm sure that on the internet somewhere, it'll tell you that there is a certain temperature, but in my opinion, that's way too much work. So just think about bath water, and I think you'll be just fine. Once I've got my water, yeast, and sugar sitting in there, I will add my 1/3 cup of oil. So this is one of those preference things. I think I said earlier, whether it be vegetable oil or canola oil, I don't think it makes a difference. But and then I just let that sit in there for just a minute. There are some schools of thought that they'll tell you that, some people will let their sugar and their yeast rise in a separate bowl. I've found that it doesn't really matter that way. I just kind of let it sit like this. And in fact, I'll come over at this point and get, some of the other, if I don't have all my ingredients out, I'll take the time, just let it sit here for five minutes or so. But again, not entirely necessary. So I've got my sugar and my oil out of the way, my water and my yeast. The one thing I have forgotten before is salt. And might I suggest that you don't forget that, because your bread doesn't taste as good. And you'll notice I'm not measuring out exactly. I'm not squaring anything off or leveling anything off. It really is just a matter of preference. But salt will also kill your yeast, so I don't add it at this particular time. So I'll just let my salt sit here so I don't forget it. But I will fill it up after my yeast and set it on the counter. But that way I don't leave it out, which I have made that mistake of doing before. So now we've got all of our ingredients out, but the flour and the salt. And I'll tell you, Casey, if you can zoom in here on what the dough is looking, or what the starter is looking like here, you can start to see all that yummy, and it smells really good too. That yeast is just reacting with your sugar. You can kind of see where the oil is separating it out, but really at this point, it's just a matter of preference as to how long you want to let it sit. Like I said, I've let it go as long as 5 or 10 minutes. And if I'm in a hurry, like I am tonight, I'll just start putting flour in. So earlier I said 8 to 10 cups of flour. The recipe calls for 10 cups, but if you put all 10 cups in, your dough will become very hard and your bread will become dense. I like my bread really airy and light, so I will go by touch and feel, and by the way that it looks in my mixer, and I'll show you what that looks like. So I start right off the bat with 4 cups of flour, and again, I'm not leveling it off. I know that this is probably every baker's worst nightmare, so that's probably a little over a cup, but I start with 4 of these right in my flour mixture at one time. So I just get 4 cups of flour, because I already know it's going to take more than 4 cups of flour, but this will give me a good mixture of my yeast. And as I turn this mixer on, I hope that you can hear me. So I'll try to try to keep it going. Cindy, I don't know if you can let me know if you can't hear me, but that's why I put my AirPods in. So I get that mixture going. Okay, great. I get that mixture going, and this is, you know, you can start to see it looks a little bit creamy and still very liquidy. So on the 5th through the 10th cup of flour is where you kind of want to pay attention. So I will take my 5th cup of flour and my tablespoon of salt, and I kind of mix them in together. And what that does is it doesn't kill my yeast right away, and it mixes in with the bread mixture. So that's kind of the one secret that that I found out, is that if you put your salt in with everything else, your yeast stops to rise, rather than if you mix it in with kind of this 5th and 6th cup of flour. But you'll notice it's going to start to look a little thicker. Here goes number 6. And I just kind of blend it 1 cup at a time so that you can start to see the consistency change, and it mixes the flour in really well. That should be 7, and I'll even count these out with you. I don't even remember the last time I counted, but you'll start to see that dough will start to pull away from the sides, and that's really what you want. Is your bowl will be almost clean when we get to the point where the dough is done. So that was 7. Here comes 8. And I'm just putting a little bit in a time here because the flour will go everywhere if I don't. But you'll start to see it will start to look not crumbly, but it'll start to gather. And this is exactly what I want to see, is and you can see the sides of the bowl are becoming clean. There's not a lot of real sticky dough left in there. I mean, the dough, if I were to touch it, is still very tacky, but it's starting to clean from my bowl. And what I want to see is all that dough come to one side of my mixer. And so I'm actually now here it's looking about the consistency that I want it. So I'm not even going to put a full cup in. I'm just going to start sprinkling a little bit of this flour in at a time until the consistency gets to where I want it. But if you can see, all of that dough right now is forming to one side of the mixer, and that's telling me it's close, right? And I think we'd put 7 full cups of flour in there, and I'm not even quite to a full 8 cups of flour, and I'm already almost where I want it to be. So that's why I tell you it's between 8 and 10 cups. It just depends on how dense you like your dough. So I'm just going to give it a little bit more of a hit, and then I think I'm going to be done. And I'll stop the mixer here in a second and kind of let you see what it looks like and feels like. But all that dough is forming to one side. And in a KitchenAid mixer, in a stand mixer, it will do the same thing. And I believe my grandmother did this all by hand. So if you really had the gumption, you could probably do it all by hand in a big, large mixing bowl. It just is easier with a stand mixer. But you can see, so I'm going to stop it right now. There's a little bit of flour that's gathered up right here. But the dough is still going to be, you'll be able to pull it, and it's still going to be sticky. It's probably still going to stick to your fingers a little bit, but this is exactly where I want it, all forming to one side of the bowl. And I still want it a little bit tacky and a little bit sticky. So I'm just going to let that go for a few more minutes. And then once I'm done with that, what's that? Yeah. Once I'm done with that, I will just kind of let that make sure it mixes in and kneads in really nicely. And really, once you can't see much of the flour at all anymore, and it's been mixing, there will be recipes that'll tell you 10 minutes, but I mean, I can tell you right now by looking at the dough, it's pretty done, but you can see it sticking to my fingers. So it's a good consistency. It's all to one side, and it's still a little bit tacky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer this into a larger bowl where it can rise and double in size. So I take Crisco, some people take butter, and what I'll do is I'll just grease up the sides of my bowl, or not the sides, but the entire bowl, because your dough will have a tendency to stick to it. So I get that all greased up and ready to go. And then I'll get the dough mixture out of the mixing bowl. And I just do this because it feels like it's got a little bit more room to breathe, and I don't like rising the dough in the Bosch. So, but what I'll do is I'll come over here and dig this out of the bowl, and you can see it's still kind of sticking to the sides a little bit, but it is coming out quite nicely. So I get that all out of the bowl and ready to go. And what I'll do is I will hand knead it for just a second, getting it into a nice ball shape. I'm trying to keep an eye on time too, so keep us honest. So I get it into a nice ball shape, and I do this because I'm a little OCD. You could probably just leave it like that in the bowl, but I like it looking really pretty. And then what I'll do is I'll take some Crisco or butter and grease the top of it so that the dough stays nice and moist. And you should be able to see or feel that warm water. Like my bread the dough is still warm to the touch. So I get it shaped into a nice ball, just like this. And then I'll take a saran wrap and cover the top. So give me just 1 second. I'll wash up my hands here and show you how I cover it and then let it rise. Cindy, maybe now would be a good time while I'm just letting this, while I'm washing my hands here to maybe see if there are any questions.
Okay, does anybody have any questions?
If not, it makes it really easy.
Yeah, you've been super thorough.
Okay, so I love this stretch tight stuff from that you can get. It just sticks to the sides of the bowl really easy. And then what I'll do is I'll set this to the side, and the warmer the environment, the better that dough will rise. So during the summer, I love it because I'll go out and set it in my garage, and my garage is nice and warm, and it helps that temperature rise. Or the dough rise. That yeast will activate and continue to rise. And what you want is for your dough to double in size. In the wintertime, I'll put it in my laundry room with a space heater and let it go. I mean, it just depends on how much time you have. And usually I'm trying to push the dough to get done so that I'm not in the kitchen all day baking bread. But what I want to do is I'm going to bring this over so that you can see. So this is a little bit larger bowl. But this dough right here, I made about I guess it's about an hour ago. So this dough's been rising for an hour, and you can see it's beautiful. It's come up over the top, and it's absolutely wonderful. And that saran wrap comes right off because we put a little bit of that Crisco right on top. So there is one step here that I'm going to skip, and what it should show you is that it's not necessary, but you could punch this down and let it do a second rise. And what that does is it gets a lot of the air out of it. It gets, there's a reason probably that somebody said to punch it down and let it rise twice. But I let my second rise happen in the bread pans. So I'll take my dough over to my clean surface. I cleaned this earlier. And there are a couple of tools I use here, although not necessary. I weigh out my loaves of bread so that each loaf is consistent. And then I used to just use a knife to cut this. Instead, I got one of these little dough cutters. And so I use a couple of these utensils just as a result of how much bread I've made. But you can see I've got my bread pans. I've got 4 bread pans out. If you want smaller loaves, that's fine. But I'll lightly grease each one of these bread pans, sides, bottom, and that just helps your bread come out a little bit easier. This is the trickiest part that people have a hard time with, and play around with it and have some fun, but it's forming it into loaves. So I will take my bowl and empty it out and completely, and you'll be able to see what happens here. As I drop that dough out, you can almost see it kind of contract back within itself. And so I'll fold it and lay it out so that I can equally divide it into fours. So, and you can see all that air kind of came out of it. And it's funny because what I found is that these are about 1.5 pounds each. And I do between 1 pound to 1.5 pounds. So right here, that first cut was 1 pound. And I'll cut this again. There's a little over 1 pound. And there's a little over 1 pound. And then this one here will probably be more like 1.5 pounds. There you go. So 4 equal parts. And again, depending on the size of your family, depending on, you know, how big or small you want your loaves or your sandwiches, it would be a matter of preference. But right now I've just got these cut into 4 different balls of dough. And dough is always best if it's turned into itself. And you can see what I'm doing here is I'm forming it and then kind of rolling it on the surface, and I'm going to make it look like a small loaf of bread. So right there, that's all there is to it. It's just folding it within itself and kind of rolling it back and forth until it looks like a very small loaf of bread. And this is probably something I could perfect a little bit better. I get in too big of a hurry where they don't look as good, but I get them tucked in here into their pans. And once they're in here, I'll let them rise about another 30 to 45 minutes, depending on the room temperature and how fast they rise. So they will rise over the top of this. You can let them go for 1.5 hours if you wanted to, and they'd rise really big, but they're also going to rise in the oven. So I'm just going to continue to take the ends of this, turn it into itself, and get that dough looking just like a mini form of bread, obviously. And that's it. So those are formed into 4 loaves. I'll take my my cooking spray and just hit the tops of them. Again, I don't use a lot, just enough to keep the dough moist and so that it doesn't dry out. Otherwise, your bread can have a tendency to dry out. If I want them to rise quickly, I'll take them over to the stove where I've turned on my oven and drape them with my tea towel or you know, something that at least will kind of harness that heat as they rise. I can let them sit right here on my counter if I want. But the idea is you'll start to see that dough double in size in here, and then you know you'll be ready for the oven. So these loaves of bread will go in the oven for 30 minutes at 350 degrees. And if you guys are anything like my family, you'll be left with 3 loaves when all's said and done, because we pull out our bread and it all gets eaten. When I pull it out of the oven, and I tried to have this done for you so that you could at least just see, I set the bread on, I take it out of the pans. I dump them right out into it. Casey helps me. I will flip them out of the pan into a tea towel. She kind of grabs them and flips them up because they're really soft. Let them cool on these cooling racks, and then you're good to go. So these, like I said, I finished these ones about noon today. They've been covered with a towel, but 30 minutes on 350 and you should be good to go. I would just watch the tops and make sure that your oven doesn't run too hot or too cold, so that, you know, that it'll burn it. But the truth is you'll be able to start smelling it. I would just check in on it, but they stay really true to form at about 30 minutes. So that's it. I mean, it's a pretty simple process, and it's nothing that is, I mean, let me tell you, if I can do this, anyone can do it. And it's a lot of fun because now our kids are bread snobs and they don't eat any other bread. It kind of sucks for me because it makes my Sundays busy, but it's something I love doing, and I can feel my grandmother close as I'm baking, and so there's a little bit of there's a little bit of, you know, some personal nature to why I do it too. So anyway, that's it. That's all. I mean, what I will do now, I wanted to make sure that I had the dough rising. You could see kind of how we form it into loaves, because that's the hardest part. But what questions do you guys have at this point? Because that's pretty much it.
Why did you put the dough to the side of the pan rather than in the middle when you formed it into the loaf?
That's a great question. So it will rise in there. You could probably put it in the middle. It rises the same. So sometimes I get the dough in there and it doesn't look quite formed, and so I'll try to manipulate it, and I can do that against the side of the pan. So, but either way, as it starts to expand, it will fill this entire bread pan. So it doesn't necessarily matter if it's in the middle or on the side.
Okay.
Great question.
So Preston, if you're doing little loaves, how many will that make?
So that's a great question. So these are 1 pound loaves each. So imagine, and these right here probably, well, take a look at this. So this is a 1 pound loaf. This is 1.5 pounds. So if you cut that in half and did a small loaf, you would double this and make 8 small loaves. It just depends on your bread pan. Let me see if I've got a couple of examples. So let me see if I've got a couple of examples. Hold on, let me get out my bread pans. So for the Relief Society gifts, I think we did the smaller loaves, and I think we were able to get like 8 of those out, 8 to 12 probably, or 8 or 9 of those. Because again, that's probably a half a pound of dough that you're tucking in there. And the problem with these smaller ones is when your dough rises, and by the way, it will rise in the oven too. So you don't want to let it go too big. But what happens is your dough will form over the top of this and bake, and then the top of the loaf becomes really heavy. And so anything more than 1/2 pound in these smaller ones is a little bit tricky. These are a little bit more normal sized bread pans. I mean, you can tell they're smaller than these, but again, a smaller tin and disposable. And I've got a variety of bread pans that I've tried. Say that again. Yeah, the dark metal tends to burn the sides of the bread. So we kind of like these lighter colors, but again, it's completely a matter of preference. The light tins that we have here, we got down at Orson Gigi, and I think they were like $10 a tin. So they weren't bad, and we love the sizes of them, and we because I love how big they are, and you can let your bread rise in there pretty. I mean, you can let it go for a while in there, and they turn out to be nice big loaves of bread. So I would say on these smaller ones, you're probably looking at 8 to 10 perhaps loaves. And then on, something like this, you're probably looking at, 6 maybe. And then on the regular size pans, they stay true to size. You can do about 4 of those. So does that answer your question?
Yeah. And I have glass ones.
That's
Those
great.
are okay too? Okay.
Yep. And honestly, whether you're doing them in the oven or on the Traeger, we've actually smoked bread. So for those of you that know me,
Greg just went, what?
Yeah. So, they are equally as good, if not better, in the smoker. So you just throw your Traeger on at your smoker at 350 degrees, and you bake them for the same amount of time, and they are awesome. So I do all my pizza doughs in there and everything. So
you've also made Greg a bread snob too, by the way. He only wants your bread.
I love it. What other great questions? Anything else?
Are there different cooking times if you use a non-stick pan versus the throwaway pan?
No, I found that it's almost identical. And again, some of this is literally trial and error. When we use the tinfoil pans, they may vary a little bit in color, but I've never pulled the loaf out at 30 minutes or 25 minutes and said, oh man, it went too long or too short.
Okay.
I've always just gone 30 minutes, and they seem to be just fine. So you may get a little bit darker edges, but then again, some people like their crust, and it just depends. I think it's a matter of preference. And on your first couple of tries, give it a shot. I mean, if it goes 30 minutes and you're in a disposable pan and it's too dark, then go for another batch and and try it again. So My sister tried a batch and let it go too long. She thought they'd be back a little bit sooner, and dough just literally like I mean, it went all over her stove. I mean, it went everywhere. She was able to recover it and you know, get it back into pans, and it worked out just fine. So even if you let it go too long and it starts to spill over the side, you know, throw it out on your counter and get it into loaves, and you would be just fine. So.
Okay.
Good.
Hey, Preston, do you use, sorry, I'm late to the party.
No, that's okay.
Real man bake bread. Do you use bread flour or like, does it matter? Can you tell a difference?
Yes, great question. I use bread flour. So let me grab this real quick. So, so I use, I've got one of these big things from Costco that I go get, you know, the peacock flour or the turkey flour from Costco, and it is bread flour. And the difference I found out between bread flour and regular flour is that there is more gluten in the bread flour. So that's what causes it to rise bigger than your all-purpose flour. So that's a great question. I do use bread flour. And I should have specified that. Great question. What else?
We are coming up on 5 minutes of our meeting time, so just wanted to let everybody know.
Cool. It's really fun, and honestly, you can't screw it up. I mean, if you did all 10 cups of flour in there, and your dough just took a little while to knead and get ready, you would just have denser, thicker bread, right? And I think it's just a matter of preference. So I just wait for the dough to form on one side of again, just kind of circling back, I wait for my dough to form on one side of my Bosch or of my mixer. And when it's all kind of to one side and it's still got that little tackiness, I have had dough in the past where I've had to scrape it out of the pan and it is sticking to my hands. And that's probably the best bread. I mean, the less flour you can use, and it's true in any sort of bread making on rolls or anything, the less flour you use, the better, because they're not quite so thick. So I hope that makes sense. But ironically enough, on my rolls, and maybe this is another Zoom for another day, but on my rolls, I use all-purpose flour, not bread flour. So it depends on the bread that you're making as to whether or not you use bread flour or not. So
Why is that? Why is regular flour better for a roll?
That was my grandmother's recipe. And again, I think probably just because I don't know that you want as much gluten in just a smaller chunk of bread than you do in like a slice of bread. And
Okay.
so that would be the only difference that I could think of. I wish I knew more of the science behind it. And honestly, there are 5 different recipes floating around for my grandmother's rolls, and it just depended on what she had lying around. She was brilliant at that kind of stuff, and I just wish I was like that. So
How many
that's a
rolls
great
does
question.
the recipe make?
So my roll recipe makes 2 dozen rolls, about 24 rolls, 25, depending on how long I let it rise for. And it is different than my bread recipe. So you use sugar, and in there's a couple of different ingredients. You use eggs and butter in your rolls as opposed to just these simple ingredients. So again, I'd be happy to do a roll lesson as we get a little closer to Thanksgiving. Maybe that'll be a little bit more fun. But
Cinnamon rolls.
And cinnamon rolls, in case you said.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
So. All right. Well, I don't want to get disconnected. If you guys have questions, you're welcome to reach out to me specifically. But thank you for the opportunity to serve you all tonight and teach you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
you.
Preston.
Thank you. You make it look easy. I hope I can do it.
Call me if you need anything.
Oh,
Yeah.
We will
thank
do it.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
See you guys.
Good night.
Bye.
Night.